Hello. Welcome to a podcast on the law and its impact on computing technology and business. This is Brian Gaff. I'm a senior member of the IEEE and a partner at the Edwards Wildman Palmer law firm in Boston. The IEEE is presenting this podcast in conjunction with a series of articles that I co-authored on legal issues relevant to people in the computer hardware, software, networking, and service businesses. These articles are appearing in the IEEE's computer magazine each month in 2012. This podcast is part 10 of our series. In the last podcast, we discussed the new ways to challenge patents. In this podcast, we will discuss the different ways to set up and organize a company. Joining me today for this podcast is my colleague, Carl Friesel. Carl's a partner in the Boston office of Edwards Wildman Palmer. Welcome, Carl.
Thanks, Brian.
Carl, let's assume that a software developer writes a great new app and wants to set up a company and hire people to commercialize it. How does he decide what type of company to set up? As we discussed in our article, there are many options, including corporations, limited liability companies, and partnerships. If the developer doesn't have much experience in these matters and comes to you for advice, what are some of the important issues that you would want him to consider?
I would focus on three principal factors. The first is where you're going to get the money for your company, the investors. And the investors care how you're organized. Some investors just don't want to invest in limited liability companies or partnerships. They may only want to invest in corporations. There are other investors who really would prefer to invest in a limited liability company or a partnership. So first consideration is who are you going to be your investors, who you're going to get money from. Another factor that I think is very important is whether you're going to be recruiting a lot of your important personnel who will be involved in the discovery work, who will be involved in sales, and how you're going to compensate them. Many times you don't have a lot of cash to compensate people, and you can't pay a lot in bonuses, but what you can do is you can offer equity in the company itself. And there are several ways that you can offer that equity depending on the form of your organization. Corporate equity plans will differ from equity plans in limited liability companies and partnerships. And each of those plans have different tax consequences and very different after-tax dollars that are available to the personnel you're going to compensate. So equity is another important factor. Equity, compensation, sweat equity, so-called. And the last thing I would focus on of the three is flexibility. Many times when you're starting a new enterprise, you really don't know where things are going to go and all the possibilities of who your investors might be, what kind of personnel you're going to be bringing in, and what expectations they may have about the form of their equity and the tax efficiency of that equity. So I often make sure that the new pool of discoveries or people who are involved in making discoveries consider that they have something flexible for the future. If they don't know for sure which one of these alternatives they like, the best thing to do is to start out with something that allows you to convert to another form without any tax hurdles. And that form would be the limited liability company. And that's where a lot of companies start out because it allows you to move into something else if it turns out your investors want you to be a corporation, if it turns out that corporate equity plans are better for your employees. You can do that without a tax hurdle. If you start out as a corporation, then it becomes harder for tax efficiency purposes to convert from the corporation to a limited liability company.
Well, what if the decision is to set up a C corporation? What's the procedure? In which state do you incorporate? What kinds of documents need to be prepared, and how long does it take?
Well, the corporation, whether it's a C corporation or in the article we also talk about S corporations, and in this regard they're the same in terms of the questions you've just asked. And they're easy to form. You can form them within 24 hours, really, and they just require articles and bylaws, and that's pretty standard. Most law firms have their paralegals actually perform that service, and it's very inexpensive and it's quick. And most people prefer, if they don't have a particular state they're located in, they want to be in that state for purposes of forming the company, they'll use Delaware. Delaware has become, For our practical purposes here, the national corporate law of America, if you will, it's the best thing we have in that regard because we don't truly have a national law. But Delaware is the most common, and they're very user-friendly at the Secretary of State's office in Delaware.
And you did mention the cost. How much should someone expect to spend in government and legal fees to get all this done?
Well, I would say to set it up and pay the fees because you'll need to get a registered agent, and if you're going to use Delaware, you'll probably spend anywhere from maybe $1,500 to $2,000 to set it up. You might be able to get a better deal for that particular part of your legal work if you're going to have follow-on legal work with the same attorneys.
I have to ask this question because I suspect our listeners are thinking about this. What about the do-it-yourself methods of incorporation, things like websites or kits sold in stores that claim someone can set up their own corporation? People seem to be interested in these methods because of their apparent low cost, but what kind of risks are involved if someone follows this route?
Well, I know it's going to sound self-serving to say stay away from the self-help kits, but it really is something I would avoid because I've seen many occasions where clients have come to me after they've used the self-help kits and they're a mess. And I don't blame them because, I probably don't know the first thing about, an electric circuit, so don't ask me to do any work in that regard. So certainly someone who's involved in, the computer technology isn't expected to be a lawyer and know all the ramifications of what you're doing. I've seen situations where people will form, for example, a limited liability company in form, and then they start to issue equity in the form of incentive stock options. Well, it makes absolutely no sense. You can't do that. They don't know that. And then when later on there's some investor who's actually going to come in and put some money into the company, their lawyers look at what you've done and they say, this is a total mess. You've got to clean it all up. And when you clean it all up, it costs you more money to clean this up than had you done it right to start with.
Okay, that's food for thought. So once you have your corporation established, what kind of formalities do you need to observe going forward?
I think it's important in a corporation in particular, less so with a limited liability company, which is a reason why some people prefer the limited liability company. But in even these small, closely held corporations, the important thing is you want limited liability, and the doctrine of limited liability in the courts has insisted upon formalities being observed. So it's important that you have minutes of your meetings, that you take board votes, you take shareholder votes, that you file your annual report to the Secretary of State, that you set up separate bank accounts, that you clearly, and this is probably the most important thing to be done, is make sure you do not mix any of your own personal banking with the corporate banking. You must keep those accounts separate. So it's very important to have good corporate hygiene. It's not that burdensome, but it really can be tremendously important. And again, when you start out without, say, institutional investors, but then you bring in some outside money for equity investing, their lawyers are going to go through everything that you've done. And they're going to insist, if you haven't done this already, put it all in the right order before they make their investment. You're going to end up spending more money at that point than had you done things correctly along the way.
Thanks, Carl, for your views on this. We hope you found this podcast helpful in understanding some issues involving the choice of a corporate entity structure. Stay tuned for our next installment in Computer Magazine. Until next time, this is Brian Gaff.
And Carl Friesel.
Feel free to contact us via email at bgaff@edwardswildman.com
Or at K Friesel at edwardswildman.com.
Thank you.